Hello to PTCGL League and anybody else who happens to have found this YouTube link. If you are watching this video, that means that the PTCGL League has debuted their newest channel called Podium Post. Shout out to J. Rue for making all that happen. Even when he's not playing, he's still finding ways to contribute to the community as a moderator, and I think that's pretty sick. I am MattyCims, here to provide my own podium post for you all. You might have seen pretty recently I won the Progression Series #1, which is the Battle Styles format, and it was maybe a bit of a rogue list that ended up taking it all. I think a lot of people going into it were expecting Rapid Strike Urshifu and friends to win it, or maybe Single Strike Urshifu and friends to win it. And even though Highoster did make a little bit of a hint early on that they thought that Cacturne was pretty strong, I don't think any of us thought it was going to win it all, and lo and behold, here we are. So this video is going to be a little deck profile / tournament recap of my run and the list that I played and all that kind of stuff. And before I get into all of it, I want to clarify one pretty important thing. This is an early post in the Podium Post series, and I want to make it very clear that making a video of your own is not the expectation for future champions. Doing something as simple as sending J. Rue a few answers to the prompts that he wants you to get answered, or maybe doing a write-up yourself, both of those are very viable and very, very satisfactory options to do for your own podium posts in the future. The only reason why I'm doing this video is because I think it just frankly makes for better content. And as a mod of this community, it's kind of my job to just make sure the community's got good stuff going on, got good stuff happening internally, and so if I can put in a little bit more extra work to deliver better content here, it's my job to do it, and I'm happy to do it. So with that, let's dive into the video here. Okay, so the main attacker for this list is the card right here in front of you that you're seeing, Cacturne. The attack is Spiny Punch that you're mainly using with it. It does upwards of 130 for having both Grass and Dark Energy onto it, but in a format like this where there's a few higher retreat cost Pokemon and not a ton of reliable opportunities to have switch cards in your hand, the first attack, Pull, did end up being pretty valuable in some situations where I needed to stall for a turn or maybe frustrate an opponent somehow, some way. It was a deceptively pretty useful attack as well. So all in all, Cacturne is really, really powerful if you can provide it with a variety of energy types. It OHKOs a lot of things in the format that like to swing into it. Things like Fearos, things like Cacturnes, things like Bouffalants and Tapu Bulus, and the Stonejourner single strike, and because of weakness, it even OHKOs a Tyranitar V. So all in all, really, really strong attacker. As far as secondary attackers go, want to call out Tapu Bulu first. I only ran a one-of copy of it because you'll see in the second attack here, usually in order to secure OHKOs with it, you have to discard all the energy on this Pokemon. And I don't have a lot of ways to accelerate in this format outside of when my Pokemon get KO'd. So it was kind of more of like an emergency, make something go kaboom kind of option. And in a format where there are plenty of basic Vs running around that have, that 220 HP and all that kind of stuff, being able to swing for a pretty high teens number of damage, I guess teens being like 16, but you know what I'm saying. Being able to swing for 160 is pretty valuable. So Bulu is in the list. I was also running 2 copies of Bouffalant as a secondary attacker. Bouffalant does a clean 120 and has a wonderful synergy with running a variety of energy types, so that was in this list. It has a pretty useful ability too that lets you do more damage to grass type attackers, which could have been valuable in this format. Didn't end up being too useful and valuable, but I think in theory, if there were more Cacturne and friends lists running around, it's great for OHKOing Tapu Bulus. It's great for OHKOing Victory Bells, which we'll get to later on. It's an ability that I didn't get to use, but I think could be helpful. In fact, I was actually a little bit hesitant to use Bouffalant because of that secondary effect of Head Charge. Doing 30 to yourself is kind of frustrating in this format. That's 25% of your health, and in general, I think a strength of running a Bouffalant is that it can tank hits from things like Fearow or a Mawile that doesn't have any single strike energies attached to it. and this kind of negates some of that perk. Eventually, you're gonna end up KOing yourself and lose that advantage that you gained otherwise. But it's in the list. It did come in handy every once in a while, and definitely helped me get to the success that I had. Another secondary attacker in this list is Tyranitar V. It is also has great synergy with this list because I need dark energies for Cacturn. It has a couple colorless energy costs, so grass works on it in those cases as well. And this list doesn't have a great way to cleanly deal with single strike Urshifu Vs or any sort of rapid strike Urshifu Vs and things like that. And Tyranitar gave me that option to swing with a single strike Crush, Oko some sort of big basic V, or in cases where I wanted to chip away, maybe disrupt my opponent a little bit, using Cragalanche to discard the 2 cards from my opponent's deck did prove to be pretty helpful sometimes. You know, in this format, there's not a lot of recovery, so if you discard through the effect of Cragalanche a really crucial Pokemon that the opponent needs, or maybe you discard some of those single strike energies that they're going to need to do a return KO or something like that. Really useful card. I only pulled 1 Tyranitar V during the polls that Hylister did for the format, but ultimately I think if possible I would have loved to have had a second Tyranitar V in the format, or at least in my deck, I mean, just because it was such a great attacker and can really sponge hits as well when I need a turn to stall and the like. Other really important Pokemon in the list include Drampa. This had a wonderfully helpful call for family attack. You'll see later on, I don't have a whole lot of ball search in this deck. Not a whole lot of way to get Pokemon out into play reliably. Drampa really helped with that. And also, it turned into a really helpful, sponge, a damage sponge of sorts in the mid to late games too. You'll find, like, I'm sure a lot of you watching this know how prominent Escape Rope was in this format. It was our only switching card that we had. And oftentimes, Escape Rope can also be really handy for disruption, where sometimes the opponent wants to target something on your bench that's already damaged or needs to get evolved up into something else, just a way to secure an Oko or something like that. And Drampa turned into a really great way to deny some of that utility from my opponents. By having a Drampa on the bench, I could sponge a hit from a Pokemon that swings for 110 or less, or just sacrifice something that isn't really crucial for my own attackers and that kind of stuff. Really great card, really helpful. And there even was a time, funny enough, where I had an energy on Drampa and there was a 60 HP Pokemon in the active on the other side of the field, and I was this close to taking my chances and going for a Spiral Rush to try to get a little sneaky KO, but I chose to build up my board state instead. But like, even in a really small pinch, Drampa can maybe be a really helpful attacker. Beyond that, I was really drawn to Weeping Bell in this format. Not as an attacker, but as a support damage modifying Pokemon. Its ability, Dangerous Mucus, is really good for adding damage onto your attacks that you're doing otherwise. I was really thoughtful and selective about when I evolved up into Weeping Bell. If I needed to stretch up to secure a KO, Weeping Bell was the person for the job, or the Pokemon for the job. I mean, a few examples of that include if I am swinging into a Victory Bell, for example, with 150 HP, with a Cacturn or something like that, or a Bouffalon Okos, but maybe some other attacker, that helps me get up into that range. Or Fearos that have 90 HP, if I combine that with a Cragalanche for 60, I can do an extra 30 through the effects of Weeping Bell here, because I make the opponent's Pokemon burned and poisoned. You have that up, that's 30 extra damage ticked off per turn. 30 plus the 60, that is an O-Code Fearo. Plus the disruption of Cragalanche. Awesome combo, loved it a lot. And even more niche reasons, I wanted to combine Weeping Bell and Tapu Bulu against opposing Single Strike Urshifu Vs, because usually an opposing one will have some damage ticks on it, somewhere between 20 to 40 damage already on it because of Single Strike energy applied to it through Houndoom, which lowers its ceiling a little bit as far as total HP goes, down to 180, down to 200, somewhere in that range. So if you do the math here, you do a Nature's Judgment, you remove all the energy to do 160 with Bulu, plus the 30 damage modifier from Weeping Bell, that brings you up to 190. So my opponent can't put 2 Single Strike energies onto a Single Strike Urshifu V through Houndoom, or else risk an Oko from this way. Or if they only put 1 on, yes, I'm 10 HP short, but now my opponent is in a really weird situation where they sit in the active and Oko Bulu, and at the trade-off of taking an extra 10 tick of poison and then get Oko themselves, not Oko, but get KO'd themselves as well? Or do they have to go around and do some like retreat shenanigans, some escape rope shenanigans, things like that? If they choose to escape rope, I can bring in the sponge of Drampa to take the Oko from Single Strike Urshifu V and maintain my other Pokemon, my other attacking Pokemon for later on in the game. Boufflant was also really helpful because it was probably the last attacker I wanted to use out of all my attackers, so it kind of also doubled as a great like secondary sponge of sorts when Drampa was on the wasn't available to have on the bench or things like that, or maybe a Drampa had already been hit for 70 and I didn't want to, and it could no longer be a useful sponge, so I needed another sponge. So Boufflant kind of helped with that a lot of times as well. Last Pokemon on the list was Victory Bell. This was also a secondary attacker. I didn't use it too often because, like I said, I was very selective when bringing up Weeping Bells, which meant that Victory Bell didn't get up and running until later on in the games. And at this point, Panic Vine is maybe a helpful stall kind of tactic. It makes my opponent forced to use an escape rope or risk a coin flip damaging to itself, things like that. There really wasn't many times where Solar Beam got up and running because of how late it arrived in the late game, but there were a couple times where it did get running, and it was really, really helpful because 150 HP is really hard to Oko in this format. So Victory Bell, if up and running, was able to get that KO with Solar Beam and then tank 1 or 2 and really throw off the tempo of the game in favor of me and hurting my opponent's tempo as a result. Alright, that was a long-winded spiel about the Pokemon in this list. Let's move on to the trainers real quick. Like I said earlier, there was very limited Pokemon search in this list. And you'll see it here, it's just one level ball copy. That's all that was pulled out of my 36 packs for Battle Styles. So I was really, really hurt on that department. If I opened Drampa, my games were really, really smoother as a result. Otherwise, I was really scrambling to establish a board state. A level ball helps get out a Cacnea, and helps get out the damage modifying line of Weeping Bell and Bellsprout. And that's really it. I have a lot of big basic Pokemon that don't have 90 HP or less. So even if I had the one level ball, it still wasn't really that helpful. But it's in the list because it's such a great, useful card. I maximized my Bruno count. I put all 3 that I had available into it because not only is it great in a format like this where you're trading a lot of KOs, so the time where if your Pokemon were knocked out becomes most of the game. Like the last 75% of the game could all be applied to Bruno, as far as like Bruno's live on the last 75% of the game, versus in Standard, if you only take 2 or 3 KOs to win a game, Bruno is much less useful. There's not many times to use it, things like that. So really critical card for this format. Really great for that reason. And on top of that, I was expecting to face a lot of single strike lists, and if I could have a couple single strike cards in my deck, like Bruno, if I needed to, for example, if I use a different draw supporter and I really needed to overextend to find the crucial card that I needed, Bruno was great to discard with the effect of Tower of Darkness to get those extra 2 cards in my hand, things like that. I ran 3 copies of Rope. In theory, this is one place where I would want to change my list a little bit. If I could go back and do it over again, I would add a 4th copy in. I can't remember if I had the 4th one available from the polls, but if I did, it's got to be in here because Drampa, for as great as it is of getting Pokemon out into the field, has a retreat cost of 2. So oftentimes you have to kind of ask yourself, do I want to sacrifice my energy attachment tempo to get Drampa out of the active, or can I find this Rope to do it instead? Crucial for that. Also crucial sometimes if your opponent needs to stall, sometimes they will escape rope something up that has a big retreat cost and you need to get it out. Rope helps it with that as well. Also helps immensely with disruption. There is no Gust supporter in this list or in this format. There's no Boss's Orders, there are no Pokemon catchers, things like that. If you want, and my best way to win is if I can disrupt my opponent's bench with disrupt their Houndooms, disrupt their Octilleries, things like that. Rope helps me do that in the early game if I have a quick start. Really, really, really strong card. 3 of Camping Gear. I would have played a 4th if I had it, but I didn't have it. This is so helpful in the early game to get some consistency going, to get your board set up, or if you need to stall for a turn in the mid game, maybe you can get this going too. It was a really, really helpful card that I will wholeheartedly support. This is probably the first time in my PTCG career that I ever played a list that had camping gear in it. I'm not a control player, so I don't ever have that in my list, and I don't have control lists that would require camping gear. So it was kind of fun to use a card for the first time ever in this list. Let's see. Beyond that, we run a Fan of Waves. Really, really, really helpful card. I added it at the very last moment, and I'm thankful that I did. It is so helpful for two things. It's helpful to slow down your opponent's build-up speed. You know, if you are trading KOs and they have, let's say, a 3 energy attacker on the bench and it has 1 single strike energy on it, you can fan of waves it to the deck, and all of a sudden your opponent can't return a KO that turn. Things like that. It's also super helpful for damage control. So, like I said earlier, especially with that interaction with Tapu Bulu, Weeping Bell, and Single Strike Urshifu V, I can really force my opponent into a weird spot where maybe I have Tapu Bulu and I have the Weeping Bell for 190, and they maybe have put 1 energy on as a smart player or something like that. I can use the Fan of Waves to say, hey, if you really want to attack with this Single Strike Urshifu V, you have to either have the energy in hand to manually attach and slow yourself down a little bit, or you have to accelerate from Houndoom and KO your Pokemon because you reached above the threshold. So it's kind of like, in some instances, the text of Fan of Waves might as well say, put 2 damage counters onto one of your opponent's single strike Pokemon. It's a really helpful card. It's awesome. I don't think having more than 1 is recommended for this format because of the consistency issues that this format has in general. I don't want to have a handful of Fan of Waves and have nothing to be able to do, but having the 1 was really critically helpful. And a general question from J-Roo is, at least that he had towards me, was, what do you think the MVP card of your list was? And it's the next one, EXP Share. Funny, it's not an attacker, it's not a draw supporter. It's EXP Share was the crucial card that made this list roll, that made this list work. It was, if I didn't have anything less than 3 or 4 EXP Share, I don't think I would have even made top cut. In a format like this, with having so many single prize Pokemon running around, that there's KOs flying left and right, basically. Because of that, it really, really, really ramps up the usefulness of EXP Share. In standard, if you're only getting KO'd 2 or 3 times, there's not a ton of benefit from EXP Share. But if in a format like this, where my active Pokemon is getting KO'd 5 to 6 times, so helpful. There's so many instances where that energy can accelerate off of the active and onto my bench Pokemon. And like you might have seen before, the only attacker that I run in this list that has a cost of 2 or less for its main attack, it's Cacturne. So if I want to attack with any other secondary attacker, I need to have EXP shares on it in order to keep up with my attachments and be able to trade KOs every single turn, things like that. If there was more reliable ways to find my Cacturnes, maybe I could afford to cut down on EXP share, but you saw I don't have a single out for Cacturne as far as trainer cards go. I was just living and dying by the frequency that I found those 3 Cacturnes in my hand. So by having EXP share, it made these other secondary attackers very viable. So awesome card. Although I am bummed that I didn't have a lot of long-term cards for my pulls, I think EXP Share could be a really sneakily valuable long-term card for these early progression tournaments until everyone gets enough V Pokemon that it's more of a 2 prize meta. For as long as it's a 1 prize meta, I think EXP Share is going to be a super valuable card. Ran 2 of Karina's Focus. This is a card that I wanted in there just for extra consistency. I usually like to build my decks to be more consistent than powerful. I really prioritize draw over many other facets of deck building. I feel like in deck building there's a lot of push-pull, balancing the scales, where it's, do I want to run a really powerful list at the cost of some consistency cards, or do I want a really consistent list that lacks power because I don't have a couple of those tech cards or a couple of those damage boosters or something like that? I'm usually more in that latter party. you might remember in the auction tournament that just happened, I loved Gardevoir. I was prioritizing getting it going into it because the whole line has phenomenal draw support. It just baked into it. And it might have cost me that tournament, but even though I didn't win that tournament, I think I made top cut because I prioritized such a consistent card in an inconsistent format. Similarly, with this, I ran into Karina's Focus, and we all kind of realized collectively that this card isn't really that great in the long run of this tournament. Oftentimes there's not many ways to reduce our hand size, so oftentimes we have 4, 5, 6 cards in our hand on average. So Karina's Focus doesn't draw you too many cards, but again, I prefer smoother, consistent lists over super powerful, super inconsistent lists. So to me, maximizing my counts of Karina's Focus and Bruno was a must. And there even was a time, there was about 2 or 3 times throughout the whole tournament where I did Karina's Focus for 4 cards, 5 cards, and even 6 cards. I remember really strongly there was one game where I started off strong, I fizzled out in the mid game, and I top decked a camping gear. And because I top decked the camping gear, I was able to use camping gear to get Karina's Focus, and Karina's Focus for a big, old, great hand. So, in general, I would probably cut one of these in hindsight, but I think having one, especially with camping gear, can be really helpful in a pinch. And beyond that, the standard 4/4 of the draw 3 cards that we received, as default, just let me get some draw, let me get some consistency. And as far as energy goes, just an 8-7 split of grass and dark. The grass for Tapu Bulu, for Cacturn, and for Victory Bell, and the dark for Cacturn and for Tyranitar V. This ended up being a pretty great balance. I didn't really feel like there were many times where I needed more of one versus the other, so I probably wouldn't touch this. If anything, I might just add a 16th energy, a grass, or a dark. I usually hate running super high energy counts, but in a format like this where there's so little draw, like there's so few cards that you draw per turn, and the fact that I either need a grass this turn for Cacturn or I need a dark this turn for Tyranitar, having that 16th energy might have helped in those moments. So yeah, ultimately I think the list was awesome, but if I can make any changes, I'd probably do -1 Bouffalant and -1 Karina's Focus in exchange for +1 Rope and 16th energy. But those are minor changes. All in all, the list ended up being great enough to win with, and really shocked a lot of folks. So with that deck profile done, I want to do a quick little tournament recap, show the route that I took to get there, and just kind of talk about a shout out here or there as well. You can see it was kind of a murderer's row in Swiss. 4 out of my 5 opponents in Swiss all ended up making top cut. And funny enough, my 3 top cut opponents were my Swiss opponents. And they all had really strong, really smooth decks, and the games were close. I think almost every single game I played in this tournament was 2-1. So, a bad break here or there might have completely changed the tournament for the better or for the worse for me. I want to give a shout out to, I believe it was Blue Cheesecake. Yeah, I think it was Blue Cheesecake, my opponent in their list. I was really thankful to see that they didn't end up moving on to being my opponent throughout Top Cut, because I had a lot of trouble with this list. I think it was really clever, and ultimately, I think in this format, Single Strike Package, very obvious archetype to run. Rapid Strike Package, really obvious archetype to run. I think Cacturn was a little bit more niche of an archetype to run. Either we didn't think it was viable, or we underestimated the value of EXP share and things like that. I think this right here, this list that we're seeing right here, is even more clever, out of left field, just took a lot of cool planning and thought to pull off. So, you might say, Matt, this looks like a pretty straightforward single strike list. You have the Houndoom line, you have the Mawile line, you have the Tyranitar line, you have things like Tower of Darkness and Urn and Single Strike Energy and Scroll of Scorn. Well, the thing is, it's single strike, but even more. I think it was really, really clever that they ran a 2/2 line of Bronzong here, because a combo that I had not thought of going into this tournament is if you slap an EXP share on the Bronzong, and if you run all that metal energy, or even some metal energy, it helps your acceleration so immensely, because Bronzong can then get that energy put onto it from your attacker that just got KO'd, and then reapply that energy to your next attacker. And between Bronzong and Houndoom, Blue Cheesecake was so easily able to power up every attacker that came in. And their synergy with Level Ball with Bronzor, it just became a really great list, especially because things like Indeedee want the big hand, and Indeedee is happy to take on that metal energy. And if you have things like Tower of Darkness and 4 Scrolls of Scorn, you are able to just discard Single Strike Pokemon every single turn, build this big massive hand. You run the 4/4 Friends cards in order to build this even larger hand. By the mid to late game, Indeedee was able to OHKO literally every one of my Pokemon, including Tyranitar V, and it was a deceptively really strong Pokemon to attack with. And on top of that, Blue Cheesecake is also, I think, the only player that I saw in the tournament that ran Mimikyu V, with its ability to basically be immune to an attack on the turn you bring it into play. And not everyone received a lot of copies of Rope. That's the only way to get around that in this format. There's no spread, there's no boss, there's nothing else. You have to just use Rope in order to get around this ability. So phenomenal late game attacker for Mimikyu V. If your opponent has 4 prizes taken, 5 prizes taken, Mimikyu V is attacking for 120, 150 for just the 1 psychic energy. I thought it was a really clever inclusion, and I don't think they made me pay for it, but I think that probably would have won them a few games at the very least in order to pull off those comebacks. So yeah, all in all, great tournament. It was fun to see those repeat opponents later on because the games were so close and so fun anyways that it was a pleasure, win or lose, to play against them. That's kind of why we're here, right? Is to have some really high action, back and forth, don't know how it's going to end up kind of games, and this tournament provided a ton of those. So couldn't have been more thankful for my opponents and for the run that I went on. Moving forward, though, I think it was kind of a flash in the pan, not something that's going to be a sustainable source of success for me, because I have my sheet here pulled up for the progression polls, and I don't have a lot of the long-term staples from battle styles that I'm going to need in future progression tournaments, especially as the meta shifts towards 2-prize Pokemon and away from the darkness type Pokemon that Cacturne hits for weakness and things like that. We'll see here with the energy line right here, I pulled 1 Rapid Strike energy and no Single Strike energy. So Rapid Strike Urshifu isn't really viable. The Urshifu and Teleon archetype in standard right now, not really viable. Can't really accelerate any kind of Single Strike energies on my Pokemon. Houndoom doesn't work with Impact energy, so that's a shame. That's kind of off the board. And if I scroll to the water Pokemon here, you will see that I pulled 3 Remoraid, no Octillery. So even more reason why I can't play the Rapid Strike package. And if I go to my fighting Pokemon, you'll see I don't have a single Urshifu V in my list too. So even more of a bummer. And if I go over to Darkness, I had the 2/2 Houndoom. I have the 2/2 Houndoom line, but what am I powering up with Houndoom at this point? Nothing. So if I go to my trainers, just to wrap it up real quick, again, the 1 of Level Ball. So a bit of a bummer in the long term. The success of this tournament was awesome, and I'm stoked about it. And I think I said it in my little write-up in the tournament channel. I look immensely forward to getting absolutely steamrolled by the rest of y'all the rest of the way. I got my 1 win. I'm happy with the 1 win, and I will lose with a smile on my face the rest of the way. So yeah, this was my my podium post. Is that what it's called? I forget the exact name of the channel. Apologies to J-Roo, but I think it's podium post. This is my podium post. I hope that you all enjoyed it and maybe even learned something yourself as far as your own deck building ideas and strategies can go. And I look forward to seeing you all in the Discord later on and in future tournaments along the way. Take care.